Good afternoon and evening and middle of the night, wherever you are. And welcome to the final South Asia Initiative event of the year. Today, we end where we began in many ways, with a theme that we've revisited many times over the last 3 years, and that is India's relations with China. Typically, when we talk about this issue, we talk about India's national policy or its official positions. But today, we will explore a dimension of this relationship that we haven't really addressed in depth: how the people of India see China. This matters, obviously, intrinsically, right? But also because in a democracy, what the people think can constrain what the government wants to do, or can propel the government to do things that otherwise might not. Do you recall there was those viral videos about 3 years ago of after the Galvan Valley clash, when 20 Indian soldiers died on the border, of Indians in a fit of rage throwing Chinese-made TVs out of windows and smashing them, right? But how much of an aberration was that? And what does that type of sentiment mean for policy? To discuss this issue, we're joined today by Aidan Milliff, who is the recently hooded, I should say, Dr. Aidan Milliff, who has been a postdoc fellow here at APARC for the past academic year. Aidan holds a PhD from MIT, and I really think he's one of the brightest political scientists working on South Asia today, in large part because he develops and uses really innovative methods and uncovers some rare data that can shed light in a unique way on some tough issues. And speaking of which, he has co-authored a paper with Professor Paul Stannerland at Chicago on Indian public attitudes towards China, right, using over 60 years worth of polling data. Now, the data themselves tell quite a story, and they have important policy implications, which is the type of discussion that we're going to have. We're going to explore those, that story and those implications today. Before we do, as always, we have a lot to go through. So I will make just one more housekeeping announcement. If you out there in Zoom land have questions, please don't hesitate to share them. Use the Q&A function. Time is short, and as always, I will be ruthless. So please keep your questions short and to the point. Now let's begin. Aidan, welcome.
Thanks, Arzan. It's great to be with you.
I want to start. I think we'll try and put up the URL of the working paper in the video description so that people can take a look at it themselves. But for people who haven't yet had a chance to read it, let's begin by discussing some of the empirical takeaways from your data, right? So could you, for all of us, set the scene just with a brief outline of the types of sources of the data that you got, and how this compares with previous studies of Indian public opinion on foreign policy?
Yeah, of course. So, I'll start by saying a tiny bit about our motivation for doing this, right? And it's exactly what you captured at the top there, which is to say that in a democracy, in an electoral democracy like India, voters are supposed to be able to constrain the actions of the government. And the government's policies are supposed to respond to the will of the people. And not only in India, but in electoral democracies around the world, whether or not this actually happens in the realm of foreign policy is a pretty live question. For one thing, you can tell just from the name, it's relatively remote from people's lives. Sometimes the issues are quite complicated, even for experts, but especially for people who may not see them as part of their day-to-day existence. So in the United States, in Western Europe, in countries around the world, and in India as much as anywhere, there is really a question about whether voters actually care about this stuff, and whether they are then holding their political leaders and their legislators to account based on their views. So that's kind of where we started with this project, and we turned from there to looking at, well, how are we actually going to measure this, right? What are we going to do to understand what the Indian voters really think? And we ended up with a pretty special source of data for doing this by looking actually back in the University of Chicago archives, which University of Chicago, for those of you who may not be aware, has an outstanding South Asia library. And one of the things that they had in this library is top-line survey reports from this thing called the Indian Institute of Public Opinion, which was a research think tank that existed in India starting in the 1950s. Still has a website, but no one answers the emails. And they ran public opinion polls about foreign policy going back to, I think the first one we have data for is 1958. This is data that's kind of been lost and then refound in the University of Chicago library in book form, and then from the Roper Center in computerized, like analyzable form. And it's got a pretty interesting history. So I'm going to spend like 30 seconds kind of saying where this comes from. It asks the same questions over and over, like every year, sometimes twice a year. It'll ask respondents how they feel about different countries, always the United States, always the USSR. And then after like 1960 or so, they start to include China, Pakistan, other countries as well. And they ask these questions about attitudes towards countries, attitudes on major foreign policy topics of the day. They ask a lot about non-alignment, for example. They ask them to a sample of literate respondents in 4 metro areas, Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, and Chennai, obviously using different names at the time. Now, how do we get these polls? Well, all of the top-line reports thank this thing called the US Information Agency, which is a defunct part of the US government, which was all about measuring public opinion around the world, disseminating information about the United States. This got folded into the State Department and then eventually folded, I think, after the Cold War. But they were really interested in the attitudes of India's public and people, urban elites in India, basically, towards the USSR and the US throughout the Cold War. And so as a product of that interest, we've got this amazing span of data, which we're able to combine with more recent, more scientific public opinion polls from names you might recognize, like Pew and Gallup. Now, the value in this is that we have a lot of the same questions asked over and over again, and across a broad swath of people in India. So we're able to make a lot of historical comparisons and a lot of cross-sectional comparisons that help us answer a pretty basic kind of descriptive question, which is, what do Indians think about China over time? This is an important relationship. And so we're trying at first to just kind of establish some of the facts.
Great. Okay. It's funny you mentioned the U.S. Information Agency. I remember when it then evolved, before it became defunct, into U.S. Information Service, and they used to have little libraries, pre-internet days, at the U.S. consulate. And I remember as a kid going to the U.S. Information Service library at the U.S. consulate in Sydney. They were the days. Okay, coming back to your paper, when you do take a look at these decades worth of data, your paper makes a couple of observations of key trends in the data. One of them is a geographic split within India on attitudes to China, and another is a sort of longitudinal trend over time of Indian attitudes towards China. So let's take a look at these two trends in turn. First, the geographic split. What is the geographic split that you see in Indian attitudes, and what do you speculate might explain that split?
Sure. So the finding here is relatively simple. It's that across time and after controlling for a bunch of other things that might structure people's opinions, like their backgrounds, education, income, identity, all those sort of things, people in the North are more pessimistic or cooler towards China, and people in the South are relatively more positive about China. The East and West India tend to resemble the North a little bit, more so than the South, but really the North is the pessimist and the South is the optimist. A couple of things to note here. The first is that while this is a pretty simple observation, it's not one that is really reflected in the political science literature. And there's an interesting reason for that. a lot of what we know about public attitudes about foreign policy comes from a pretty small number of countries: the US, Western Europe, and Israel. Now, in the US, you don't get much exploration of regional variation in foreign policy attitudes because, to parrot a common phrase, the US has got fish on two sides and pretty weak friendly neighbors on the other two. And then in places like Israel, which has a more threatening local environment, there just isn't meaningful geography for there to be geographic variation in how people feel about external threats. So the idea that there's this big split between what people in northern India and southern India think, pretty simple finding, but something that we think breaks a little bit of new ground. Now, getting to the kind of logic to that, one of the things that we think might explain this is, again, pretty prosaic. It's just basic exposure to the threat. This is kind of consistent with a working paper by our Stanford colleague, or sorry, not a working paper, a published paper by our Stanford colleague, Jamie Hinson, writing with Milan Vaishnav, who shows that people who are kind of exposed to the costs of war, the areas where victims in the Pulwama attack came from, have much more pessimistic opinions about the government and much less rallying around the flag in the wake of that attack than Indians at large. We think that this kind of reflects a bit of the same trend. People who are potentially closer to the India-China border, people who might be more impacted by conflict between India and China, are more pessimistic about China, have lower approval ratings of China. People in the South, thousands of more kilometers away, are relatively insulated and then relatively less pessimistic, we think.
So, I mean, that's really interesting, right? Because you can understand why that sort of dynamic would be at play in places like Ladakh and Arunachal. But I mean, if you're in UP, that's still the north of India, which I assume in your split is part of the north. That is pessimistic towards China. It's still, UP is still a far way away from the LAC. So this idea that you are proximate to the Chinese threat is I mean, I understand it, but it's still a noteworthy distance from China for that effect to take place.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I think that, to connect this to some other work that I've done, exposure to threat is kind of a matter of perception. And that's what I think of to kind of square that circle. I can also say, and this is not in the paper, but it's in some other analyses that we've run, that people in northern India are also more pessimistic about Pakistan and more attuned to the threat that terrorism poses to the lives of Indians, which is especially interesting given that you would expect people in the West, Maharashtra being in the west of India, according to the way we'd split the geography, to be really attuned to the threat of terrorism and this kind of critical threat. But it seems like geographic proximity is really important, even leaving aside that history. So we see this across other foreign policy domains as well, which might say something about geographic proximity. There also might just be something special about the politics and attitudes of the collection of states in the Hindi heartland. And that's not something that we're able to really untangle in this paper, but we're excited by the question, and we'll be looking at it, and we're encouraging others to as well.
Yeah, see, and that's sort of what I was starting to get towards, because I wonder if there is something to this idea of the Hindi belt being the key sort of dividing line or the key locus of these attitudes. And especially because one of the other interesting findings in your paper is that partisanship does not predict attitudes towards China, right?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, this is one of these things where, we have what we think are pretty simple explanations for both of these facts individually, but then when you put them together, it gets to be quite a puzzle. So, like you said, party preferences, especially preferences for the BJP, which is what we measure in the 2010s, don't seem to be a major influence on people's foreign policy attitudes, again, after controlling for all these kind of canonical explanations. We conclude that party preference just isn't a major way that people structure their foreign policy attitudes. And we think that that's probably because foreign policy is not politicized the way that it's increasingly politicized in the US. But there are things that could change that, right? Increasing polarization, like what we've seen in the US, could kind of split a foreign policy consensus. But basically, the evidence we see from India is not consistent with the idea that this is a particularly live domestic political issue. So if there's something going on in the Hindi heartland, it again has to be separate from the underlying demographics of the place, and it's got to be reasonably separate from the kind of political preferences and preferences for the BJP that are common in states like UP.
Yeah, that's excellent. I want to explore a little bit the other key trend that you identified, which is a longitudinal trend, the trend in attitudes over time. And this is a very sort of macro impression of trends spanning decades. Can you elaborate?
Yeah. So what we see going back all the way to after the 1962 war, which is when the US Information Agency starts asking about China in these India surveys, we see pretty impressive change over time, and it's not all in one direction. It's not a monotonic change. So to narrate the long history very quickly, what we see first is a lot of thawing. When they institute the question, I think in 64 or 65, Indians' attitudes towards China are very negative. This is no surprise. No political scientist probably needs to go writing a paper about that particular finding, because the Indian government just concluded a pretty disastrous war against China. What we see starting in the 1960s is this impressive thawing over time. And that kind of matches this increasing public approval, these thawing attitudes towards China among, again, remember, the urban literate public at this time, is consistent with changing trends in kind of the high politics, right? India and China move over this period of time in the 70s and into the 80s towards kind of an opening and improving ties. And we see that public attitudes are mirroring that. To put this in the political science language, this is really consistent with what Bruce Gentleson calls the pretty prudent public theory of public attitudes. People are basically responsive to broad trends in geopolitics when they're shaping their attitudes. Now, in the 2000s, we see things going the opposite way. And we see a little wrinkle to this pretty prudent public theory. We see that favorability is declining over time, starting in the early 2000s when we get this modern scientific data from Pew and Gallup. We see that favorability towards China, approval of China, is declining. And that's occurring even as the UPA and then the NDA governments have actually tried to maintain relatively positive relationships at the elite level. So what we're starting to see here is a bit of a split, and there's a little bit of evidence of this earlier. Public opinion is not super responsive to certain pronouncements of Nehru, right, in the early 60s. But what we're seeing in the 2010s is evidence potentially of a kind of split, where the government is relatively optimistic about maintaining good ties with China, going into and past the Doklam crisis in 2017, relatively optimistic about maintaining good ties with China, and public attitudes towards China are declining year over year through all of that. So that's kind of where things stand now, is that the majority of Indians don't have favorable opinions towards China, and this is increasingly out of step with the way that the government wants to deal with China.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's interesting that even incidents like Doklam seemed to have an impact on public opinion, but perhaps less so on national policy. I wonder, have you seen in that sort of big picture longitudinal trend, did you see any evidence of critical junctures or inflection points that may have caused a change in Indian attitudes? I would assume that 2020, if the data covers it, would have been one such critical juncture. But prior to that, I think you say that earlier non-violent border crises did not really have such an impact. Is that correct?
That is right. And the data that we're using don't cover 2020. So this is something that we're going to have to look into in the future. But like you said, the border crises, and we have data covering the crisis back to Sundarong Cho in 1986-7. The border crises from the 80s through Doklam in 2017, there isn't particularly strong evidence that they matter. And this is, again, a point where we see kind of a disjuncture or a growing split between public attitudes and the opinions of elites. Now, neither you nor I are going to remember this, but if you go back in the Times of India archives to the coverage of the Sundarang crisis, this is framed in actually very much the same way that the Ladakh crisis and very much the same way that the Doklam crisis were framed, potentially an existential problem because of the escalatory potential of the situation. So this is, if you ask foreign policy elites and security elites at the time, this is a big, big deal. And it is just not really reflected in public attitudes. If any of the border crises are reflected in public attitudes, it is Doklam. Now, the challenge here is that, like I said a minute ago, approval of China is declining through the 2010s. And it declines over, we get yearly measurements. And the decline between 2017 and 2018 is perhaps a little steeper than the decline between 2016 and 2017, but we can't really strongly attribute that to Doklam. If any of them do seem to matter in people's opinion, it would be that one. By that logic, Ladakh would matter even more, especially because of the fatalities at Galan. But we're not totally able to draw that conclusion from our data. What we can say is that it seems like media coverage might make a bit of a difference. There's a big difference between the way Sumdorong Cho was covered and the way Doklam was covered. Again, going back to the Times of India, we see that across this crisis, which lasted 300 something days, I think, before its final resolution, you get about a Times of India story a month, and they're not very often on the front page. Part of this is because in 86 and 87, there are a lot of other security crises to contend for those column inches in the Times of India, including, of course, the Punjab crisis, issues with Pakistan. But it's just not something that's necessarily going to be top of mind every day for even a person regularly reading an English language data. Doklam, as we probably both do remember, was covered very, very differently in 2017. And again, we can't draw any super firm conclusions here, but that's a difference that we think, based on some American politics research, might matter in understanding why some border crises look different than others in the way they're reflected in public opinion. And again, by that logic, the 2020 crisis in Ladakh would be the biggest dose of media attention and the biggest potential push to shift public attitudes.
Well, indeed. I mean, in large part, as you say, because there were fatalities in 2020 that there were not in previous crises. But also, I suspect even the exact same crisis occurring in 2023 would generate a completely different social media response than it would have 10 years earlier, right? Well, there would have been a zero social media or negligible social media response 10 years earlier. So presumably over time, even the same crisis on the ground will have different reverberations, larger reverberations in the information domain, which I guess is what really matters in public opinion.
Yeah. I mean, there's great work that other scholars have done to understand the impact of social media on political discourse in India. And everything that we can read from there suggests that this probably does matter for foreign policy attitudes as well. That's definitely something that we want to look into in the future, see if we can get a better handle on how media coverage makes some crises different than others.
Absolutely. I want to explore in much greater depth this gap, this lag between public attitudes and official policy. But before we do, we've actually got a question from the audience, which is a really interesting question, going back actually to the geographic split, right? The idea is that, look, there are some villages, the person asking the question has posed the question in terms of villages, right? Which supply a large number of people into the armed forces. I'm assuming your data may not have that sort of granularity, that sort of level of fidelity, but could we still apply a similar concept, similar dynamic at a larger scale, maybe even at the state scale? Because some states have either they feed more into the armed forces, or they just have a more intimate historical relationship with the armed forces than other states. Could that be a factor?
It could be a factor. And maybe as a result of just what I know from other work, all the examples that are coming to mind here are places that are in North India. And I know that that's not, universally true of where the armed forces draw from. But yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. And you could imagine, especially that the regimental towns or the garrison towns for the units that end up on the LAC have systematically different attitudes about this kind of stuff. We actually, we see some of these kinds of differences in the United States. There's some evidence that I've found in other work, for example, that being a veteran pretty systematically changes threat perception around foreign policy issues. So it wouldn't be hugely inconsistent to see the same thing in India. But you're right that that's not something our data can cover precisely. Again, I'll recommend this great paper in the American Journal of Political Science by Milan Vaishnav and Jamie Hinson, which uses a different kind of data and is able to kind of look at this. And it shows that in the areas like within 5 or 10 kilometers around the funeral processions for Jawans who died in the Pulwama attack, you see much lower BJP vote shares in 2019. So I think that's really consistent with what this person is asking.
That is really interesting. Okay, let's get to the big issue of public policy. Of public attitudes and national policy. You've already hinted at this, but just recap for us. Is there a lag? What is the lag that you have observed? Because if you were just an observer if you were just a reader of the newspaper, you would have noticed quite a rupture in India-China relations starting in 2020. How does that relate to the trajectory of public opinion towards China?
Yeah, so the change at the elite level, which looks like this major discontinuous shift or this big rupture, is something that's kind of been supported from below for quite a long time. I don't have the chart right in front of me, but approval of China is underwater, more disapproval than approval in public opinion polls for years before 2020. So you could say that this is an example, or you could say that this is evidence of the government kind of lagging behind or chasing public perception. Now, again, we can't make super strong causal claims about whether the government is responding directly to what they observe in public opinion, but we can say that it's pretty different from one of the kind of stylized facts about foreign policy attitudes, or one of the kind of pieces of received wisdom from the 90s and the early 2000s in the social science literature, which is that when people form opinions about this stuff, because most of us most days don't care, when people form opinions about this stuff, it's by drawing cues from foreign policy elites, and especially from partisan political elites. And what we're seeing in the 2010s in India is just not consistent with that idea. That may happen in some places at some times, but it doesn't seem to describe attitudes towards China, because if that were the case, we should see systematic differences between BJP voters and voters for other parties. And we should see that the opinions of the public are never too far behind and very seldom ahead of the policy of the partisan elites who they're drawing cues from. So those are maybe our expectations if we take a very, very simplified version of this received wisdom. And what we see in India is actually something quite different. It also is a bit of a different perspective on the agenda setting power of the NDA government, which I think many people assumed and many people wrote to this effect, that the agenda setting power of the NDA government on foreign policy issues was pretty substantial. There are probably other issues, especially to do with Pakistan, where that is the case. But with China, we see some suggestive evidence of the opposite dynamic, that the public is thinking one thing, and then the NDA is shifting after the fact towards that direction.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting, especially, and we'll come back to the Pakistan point of contrast in a minute. But it's really interesting that the government has limited capacity to shape public, or at least has proven limited shaping of public opinion to date. But what about the other way, right? At the top of this webinar, we started talking about the expectation that in democracies, governments should take their cues somewhat, at least, from the people. Do we see any evidence of public attitudes tying governments' hands when it comes to policy towards China? And again, I'm asking for sort of speculation on causality, but are there any indications that that's happening?
Yeah, so this is a tough thing to observe, right? Because what it takes to see evidence of the public tying the government's hands is we need to know that the government wanted to do one thing and then was constrained by the public and ended up doing some other thing. And we seldom have access to those kind of deliberations or that kind of negotiation. So it is quite a puzzle. And I should say, you know, what we think we see with the public opinion kind of leading changes in government policy, I think what we take from that is just that the government's power to set the agenda here is not infinite. The government may still have some agenda setting power. They may have power to shape the media environment and the way things are portrayed, but they don't have an entirely free hand to do whatever they want. So it's somewhere in the middle. I'm personally, and this is going a little beyond the bounds of the paper here, so I definitely don't want to speak for Paul in this regard. But I'm personally not totally sure that we're evidence of that hand tying. Paul and Vipin Narang have pointed out in other work that accountability for these kind of foreign policy decisions, the environments for accountability, depend hugely on the electoral salience of foreign policy issues. That's something we haven't talked about a whole bunch. We've talked about the content of foreign policy opinions, but the thing that really seems to matter for whether or not they effectively hold the government accountable is whether the content of those opinions is important when it comes time for voting. And that's not always true in India. It's not always true in any democracy. And I think that that's a really important ingredient that we don't always see in terms of turning opinions into accountability.
Yeah. Now, but if we're talking about this puzzle of how do we know if the government's hands are being tied, right? Obviously, the sort of definitive account would be that, you know, we have some authoritative indication of what the government wants, and then it chose to do something different. Or a less reliable proxy would be if the government is pursuing a policy and then gradually shifts that policy, right? And so what I'm thinking of here is the observation that some commentators have made post-Ladakh, post-2020, that there was a stark diplomatic and economic rupture, right? The relationship cannot return to normal until the border issue is settled, right? And then suddenly a whole bunch of indicators over time, gradually, as the months and years pass, a whole bunch of indicators start to suggest that maybe the rupture is not so complete. Trade continues and indeed expands. The trade deficit continues and indeed expands. So there is some indication, at least, that the policy as initially declared is not consistently pursued. And there may, of course, be other reasons for that. There may be other causes for that. But that could also be, could it not, plausibly some evidence of public opinion driving policy, at least in the initial phase, right? So public opinion demands a strong government response. And then once the public cools on the issue, once it comes off the front pages, the government can go back to doing what it wants to do.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that in these moments of very high salient, like right after the casualties at Galwan, public opinion imposes a constraint, a hard ceiling on the kind of positive and conciliatory things that the government can do. Now, I think that the government has perhaps cannily realized that attention is not infinite for these issues, and that once people's attention is elsewhere, they have more freedom to get into a problem solving or conciliatory or negotiating mode. But there probably still is, in that, you know, negotiating mode, a hard ceiling on exactly what they can give away and exactly how positively they can be interacting with China. But yeah, I think that what you hit on right there is exactly that. It all depends on kind of the searchlight of public attention. And when the searchlight is shining on Ladakh, there probably is, because of underlying negative sentiment, there probably is a real hard ceiling on the kind of heights that the India-China negotiation and compromise can reach. And that's potentially a kind of scary thing looking forward. You would want, perhaps, if you were in government, you would want, perhaps, if you were in Washington, for there to be a floor on the positivity of the relationship, not a ceiling.
So, but related to that, right, one of the other observations that people have made of government policy in the whole of that crisis has been that the government has been very tight-lipped about what it's doing, right? Sometimes it's been a little bit ham-fisted. It's the Prime Minister has maybe misspoken once or twice about the existence or the lack thereof of PLA troops on Indian territory. But overall, the government's been pretty tight-lipped. It hasn't really had a concerted information campaign to let the people know about what's happening month by month in this crisis. And the opinions that are sympathetic to the government on this issue say, well, that's just because the government wants to maximize its negotiating latitude, right? That it wants to maximize its freedom of action, because public attention, again, ties hands. So of course you want to keep this sort of stuff behind closed doors. But does that square with, does that logically make sense? Would you, if you wanted to maximize your negotiating space, would you be remaining tight-lipped, or would you be trying to shape the information domain a bit more than they are?
I think that in this circumstance, the Indian government is keeping more space open for itself. And again, I should say this is getting far beyond the analysis in the paper, but I think that in this circumstance, the Indian government is keeping more space open for itself by not making it a huge public issue. And I think that's because there's not a huge amount for them to gain from raising public attention around this, right? There isn't a major constituency, aside, oddly, from, this is, speaking of all kinds of other developments that go back past the end of our data, BJP supporters in the South, which largely means Karnataka, are relatively positive about China, and they're kind of a standalone group within India in that regard. But other than that odd constituency, which may be different now than it was in 2018, there isn't a huge domestic base that's going to that you're going to win over by increasing the visibility of negotiation with China. And there potentially is, as you pointed to, there might be a domestic base. I don't know that the BJP would lose them, because I, again, don't know how salient these issues really are. But there's a domestic base that you might disappoint, at the very least, by not showing strength. So I don't know. I suppose I would not be, this is not one of these situations like we read in our IR textbooks, like in Putnam, where you can effectively use a domestic constituency to kind of draw a red line behind you and push the negotiation in a direction that's helpful to you.
I mean, but the reason I bring this up is because if the public's sort of prior or baseline approach is hostile to China, right, then keeping an issue out of the public domain would serve the government's interests if the government wanted to do something that it thinks would upset the public, right? That is to give concessions in negotiations, right? So to me, that suggests, and check my logic here, and understanding this is outside the scope of the paper narrowly, but on the broader issue of how a government manages this two-level game, it suggests to me that government wants to retain freedom of action in this information landscape of hostility towards the rival. The government would want to maintain its freedom of action if it wanted to do something that was less hostile to the rival, correct?
I think that is that's a good inference to draw from what we see, basically, right? Again, using this logic of two-level games, or there's a quote from like the TV series The West Wing, which is kind of helpful here, right? You toss your cap over the wall if you want to force yourself to climb over the wall to go and get it. I don't think reading again with no inside knowledge, no special analytical expertise here, because this is getting beyond the realm of public opinion, I don't infer from what I see that the Indian government actually has much of an interest in going over the wall to get the cap. And so they're reluctant to toss it. They're reluctant to say to China, hey, we can't back down here as much as we'd like to. We can't back down here because this is not what our democratic public wants. So if you believe that the Indian government has the ability, and I don't know whether they do, but if you believe that the Indian government has the ability to kind of dial up and dial down the salience of this problem, then if they wanted to pursue a really aggressive solution, it could make sense to dial up the salience more. And as you pointed out, we have not seen that.
Okay, so this seems like an opportune moment to segue into, again, an issue outside the scope of your paper, but that we've alluded to a couple of times so far, and that is the contrast with Pakistan, right? In public attitudes in India, there is it is axiomatic. It's a constant that there is a view that sees Pakistan skeptically at best. What does the contrasting case of Pakistan tell us? Does it shed any light on the public opinion government policy lag? What can we infer from that?
Yeah. So this is again some analysis that we had a chance to do that didn't make it into the paper. Opinions towards Pakistan across time and across sectors of India are not terribly surprising data, to be pretty honest. They're often negative. They don't ever really get very positive, even during periods of conciliation between India and Pakistan. There actually is the same regional trend that we see as with China, where people in northern India feel less positively towards Pakistan. They rate the threat of Pakistan as qualitatively larger and more critical, and they rate the threat of terrorism as qualitatively larger and more critical than respondents in other parts of India in the 2000s and 2010s. But I think zooming way back out, the macro story of the difference with Pakistan is just that there's not really public support for conciliation at any point, but there is more of a domestic political cleavage. And this is not something we go into in our paper, but the issue of Pakistan lines up with domestic political coalitions more so than the issue of China. And so I think that makes it a more live issue in Indian politics, while simultaneously being an issue in which there's less variation across people and over time. It's kind of an interesting paradox, right? Because opinions are more consistent, but the political differences over those opinions seem to be a little more salient. You could come up with a number of reasons for this, including increased salience of religion in Indian politics, recent history of threatening Indian civilians as opposed to troops on the border through groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba. But the issue presents really differently from attitudes towards China. And I think it ends up being kind of an evergreen opportunity for Indian politicians to show strength should they want to. And that just makes it look really different in the data.
That is also really curious, right? That's another big gap between the public and the elites, the policymaking elites, because I think it's probably fair to say that the security apparatus of India has for probably some time, and certainly since Ladakh, considered China to be its primary strategic challenge. And yet the public opinions, especially curious if you separate out Pakistan from the threat of terrorism, still considers Pakistan as distinct from terrorism to be a greater threat.
Yeah, no, I think that is an interesting issue. I will say one reason that you might see the security community consider China to be the pacing threat is kind of like US military language, but one reason you might see the security community consider China to be the big threat that they're concerned about is because at a kind of conventional correlation of forces level, the matchup against China looks far worse than the matchup against Pakistan. So it kind of it we're talking a lot about public opinion and perception of these broad geopolitical trends, and the underlying balance of power is also pretty different across these issues. And that seems to refract through the domestic politics in kind of weird ways. But if I were a military planner in India, I would, of course, think very differently about China than about Pakistan, because the strength of the forces in the relevant theaters is less favorable. The geography is pretty darn difficult on the Indian side of the LAC. There are a lot of challenges there that don't exist with Pakistan, that might mean that the security elites are swerving in a different way compared to domestic public opinion than they are with China.
What'll be really interesting is if in coming years and or decades, if we see, as I expect we will see, a greater Chinese challenge in the Indian Ocean region, whether that then creates a greater sense of proximate threat to southern India, right? This issue that you noted at the beginning by observing that there's a north-south split. That's because China has not been a resident challenge, a resident power in the Indian Ocean. But if that were to change, and especially if there were a couple of episodes, not just Chinese ships floating around the ocean, but actually a couple of episodes of coercion or skirmishes, then I wonder if that regional balance would also shift. Or maybe, Southern Indians are just sanguine about all sorts of threats.
Well, I'm not going to make any comment about Southern Indians generally, of course, but I think that's an interesting idea, right? The one thing that I want to caution, and I think this is a tendency that we have as social scientists who think about international relations all the time, is that it really does seem in India, in the United States, in Israel, democracies around the world, like it takes a fair amount for foreign policy issues to really break into the media diet of people who don't, earn their paycheck by learning about this stuff. So I think that it is true in principle that increased maritime competition in the Indian Ocean could kind of change the regional differences in exposure to threat. But I think that things happening over the horizon would have to be pretty dire in order to really catch the attention of people in southern India in the way that Ladakh caught the attention of people all over the country.
Yeah, that's right. I guess the one other transmission belt for this is not just geography, but also whether co-ethnic groups come under greater threat in one place or another, and be they Tamils or Bengalis, if there are Chinese, if the threat picture changes around India's southern rim in other countries, right? Not just on the water. Let's zoom. Oh, sorry, go on.
No, I just that's a really interesting thing to look out for. I mean, the kind of cross-border ties between exactly those two groups are potentially really interesting.
Let's in our final section really zoom out a little bit. I want to now wrap up a couple of these threads and see if we can reflect a little bit on what these public attitudes and noting both the geographic split as we've been talking about it, but also especially the longitudinal trend and the absence of a party political split. What does that tell us about Indian attitudes towards, or India's approach, New Delhi's approach to the rivalry with China? How structural is that rivalry? How contingent is it based on what the public in India says? And the sort of flip side of that is how malleable might Indian policy be if public attitudes also shift or take the lead in shifting? How fixed is this opinion?
From our reading, and this is based on some analysis that's not in the paper, but that we did for an earlier version, Indians' skepticism of China, Indians' trepidation about sharing a border with China is born of some reasonably deep structural issues. Uh, Indians are not just worried about territorial disputes, they're worried about the growth of China's economy. They're worried about the role that China is going to play in the world broadly. And so because people's attitudes seem to be based in these kind of like big macro historical trends, these things that have kind of come up over 20 or 30 years, I don't think of them as extremely malleable in the short term. It's also worth noting that we're at a pretty low point right now. I wrote it down here, and I am going to double check. As of 2018, the end of our data, only 1 in 4 Indians expresses approval of China's leadership. So getting up to ambivalence or up to positive attitudes towards China is a long climb. And it's a climb that I don't see as super likely to happen in the short term because people's disapproval is based on these kind of big structural things. What have we seen over the past that should give us some kind of insight into how this works? We see that the Indian public really does respond to changes in the geopolitical situation. The thaw with China after 1962-63 did really seem to change people's attitudes towards the country to the point that at the end of the Cold War, people were reasonably or as positive as they've ever been, and something like half and half. Now, what do we take from this? One thing that we could say is that it's not necessarily in vain and not necessarily a horrible idea for the government to try and continue improving relationships, even if the public attitude is lagging. Because if those efforts at cooperation do bear fruit, people seem to recognize them in the long run. They don't recognize them at the level of communiques or border disputes or summits or the kind of things we pay attention to. But in the long run, if India and China have a better relationship, people's opinions about the threat posed by China's economic growth, the role China plays in the world, that kind of thing, really could change. But the causes of distrust are structural, and it would take a lot of work kind of against the currents of domestic attitudes to make the kind of improvements that the Indian public would see. So how malleable is Indian policy? I think it's moderately malleable because, again, as we were talking about earlier, the accountability environment isn't structured such that individual members of the Lok Sabha, or especially the government, are really going to be held to account for these kind of foreign policy issues. They're probably just not the highest priority for most Indian voters. But there is a little worry that creeps in around the edges, right? The worrying thing is that if attitudes constrain foreign policy in any way, it's probably, again, putting a ceiling on the amount of cooperation that India and China can attain. It's probably a negative nudge, if a light one. And there are things that could change that could change public opinion. But as it stands now, I guess I wish that there were the opposite constraint in the name of kind of producing cooperation and avoiding conflict between the two countries.
It's interesting because I also want to ask you about the sort of structural foundations, vice malleability of Indian attitudes towards the US, right? Because as you mentioned earlier, the US is also one of those countries about whose Indian attitudes was measured in those earlier polls. And so I want to ask you that question about the structural durability vice the malleability of those attitudes. But it's also interesting because just as you were talking, the news over the past couple of days has been here in the US about the initial signs of a diplomatic outreach between the US and China, right? Despite the fact that China is an issue of increasing electoral salience in the US, and it would seem bipartisan consensus on hawkishness towards China. And yet the government, in its wisdom, considers that maybe talking to the rival is not such a bad idea.
Yeah, So on the US point, and to be clear, that we've shifted fully into Aidan's hot takes here because I'm not an expert on US domestic politics or US diplomacy. But I think as someone who does spend a fair amount of time thinking about like the consequences of violence and studying the consequences of wars, especially in India, that I wonder if a lot of American voters have um, either not internalized or forgotten the consequences of a war with a peer competitor, right? We genuinely have not been involved in one for a very long time. If you ask the people who paid the consequences of the global war on terror, people in the US, even though people around the world paid those consequences, if you ask the people in the US who were affected by that, I think that they, and then, they may be some of the military leaders driving these discussions, they are maybe more energetic about avoiding the downside risk of a war. Or I hope they are, because I think that they have a very different sense of what the consequences of failing to cooperate are. On the US and India, though, this is an interesting thing. Again, we see this, okay, first thing I should say, the baseline is just way higher. Indian attitudes about the US plummet once over the course of our data, and I'll get to that in a second. But in general, Indians approve pretty strongly of the US. We know from work by our APARC colleague for this year, Nirvikar Singh, with Devesh Kapoor and Sanjay Chakravarti, a lot of Indians want to come to the US, and there are really strong people-to-people ties between these countries. Overall, a strong foundation for positivity. I also think that the US-India attitudes relationship is a little bit more about status than it is with China. You're far more of an expert on this than I am, but India has got a long-term interest in preserving strategic autonomy and not being seen as kind of a vassal to a superpower like the United States. This is kind of an impressionistic kind of written from the airplane version of events, in something I'm not a real expert in, but it is borne out a little bit by our data. The one time where Indian attitudes towards the US genuinely plummet before recovering is the year that the USS Enterprise sails into the Bay of Bengal. This took attitudes from like many points above break even to like as low as China is now. Was that really the United States talking about fighting a war against India? As a non-expert, I don't think that's what actually was happening, but it was a real affront to India's prerogative to shape foreign policy and protect its own security in its neighborhood. So drawing maybe too much from that example, I see concerns about status as being a major driver of public attitudes here. And that's something that I think is important for policymakers in the US to pay attention to. We probably don't think about that enough when we're interacting with other countries in the United States. But it's also probably good information for the government in India to understand that, and I'm sure they do understand that Indians have favorable attitudes towards the United States, but they want those favorable attitudes in some sense to be reciprocated, and they want the respect to be reciprocated.
Yeah, and indeed. And it seems that just over the past weekend, from what US officials and military leaders were saying at Shangri-La, that message has been internalized by the US, right? Because it is a consistent and well-articulated point that the two countries are partners, that it's not a sort of unequal relationship. It is a relationship of co-equals. So I think they certainly get that. Aidan, we are out of time, unfortunately, but I think this has been a tremendously useful session because, and the paper that underpins it is tremendously useful for a couple of reasons. One is just from an academic point of view, this is yet another example where the empirical basis or the empirical case of India has something to teach political scientists about the world, right? That India is no longer just something that you apply Western-derived theory to, but it is something that can build theory for the rest of the world as well. But also from a policy point of view, it's quite stark how strong and durable are Indian popular attitudes towards China. and how structurally founded they are, and how they are not ephemeral. They're not just the result of social media, despite some swings here and there, but there is a solid foundation to this. So with that, I thank you very much, Aidan, and I thank you all out there for joining us in Zoomland.